Hello everyone, this is Eric. Today we are going to look at pushing your records from a gallery to a data source. Now, one of the most used controls in Power Apps is a gallery, and usually the gallery is supposed to store records from your data source. There are instances where you may want to push the record in the gallery to another or a different data source, or you may want to edit the record in the gallery and then update the record that had been updated in the data source. And so there are several ways of achieving same with the patch. You can use the update if function, you can use the update function, you can use the collect function. But today we are going to focus on the patch function. Okay, so we are going to look at patching directly from inside the data source, inside the gallery. We are going to patch from outside the gallery, that is placing a button that is not inside the gallery. Then we are going to look at how to push the records from a gallery to a collection, and then finally pushing them from the collection to the data source. And we are also going to look at other scenarios, including patching new records and then updating records. So it's supposed to be an exciting tutorial. Thank you very much, and let's get straight to action. Okay, so this is my gallery with 4 items. As you can see here, there are 4 rows. So when I scroll down, I have 4 items in my data source. Now my data source, this is my data source. The name, my first list. I have the items ID, first name, amount, title, and other columns. Now this is connected to this gallery, and so this is exactly what we are going to use for the various example. But before then, let's look at the patch function. When we look at the patch function, you can see that you use patch to modify records in corporate situations. So basically, the patch function is used to modify record as well as create new record. And to create new record, we use the default as it is stipulated here. Okay, so let's go back to the Power Apps and see how these things goes. Okay, so when we look at the gallery, when we look at this screen, I have some checkboxes, and then I also have a toggle control. Now, if you want to patch a particular item, so for example, we want to patch Yao 12,001, the first record, we want to modify and then patch it back to the data source. When we look at the first record, we have for Yao, we have amount 12,000, and the other ones continues. So we want to change Yao to say Kojo, and then we are changing the 12,000 to say 13,000. Now, if you want to update this new record back to the data source, on uncheck of this checkbox, I have a formula here. So this is what we are going to do. We are going to use the patch function, and then the patch function is taking the data source and then the record that you want to update, and we are updating this particular item which is in the gallery, this item. Then we are updating 2 columns. We are updating the first name, and then we are updating the amount. Now the first name is in the first name text box, and then the amount is on the amount text box. So when we look at the uncheck you see that the first name matches to the first name text box dot text, and then the amount we have wrapped it with value because it is a number or a currency column. So with this new changes, when we click on the checkbox, when we tick the checkbox, we see the dot 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 moving, and then we see that the record has really changed from Yao to Kojo. So when we look back, it is still Yao and then 12,000. And then let's refresh the data source. After refreshing the data source, we see that Kojo, it has changed to Kojo, and the amount has really changed from 12,000 to 13,000. So that is the first example of patching directly from inside the gallery back to your data source. So what it means is that whenever you check any of these checkboxes, the changes that have been done inside the gallery will be recorded back to your data source for it to update the old record to capture the new record. So that is the first example. The second example, what if you want to check this checkbox and then whatever is here is repeated or is created as a new record inside the data source. So for instance, I change this one to Mansa Musa, and I change this to 10,000. And I want to create this as a new record in my data source. When we look at the data source, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 items, and I want to create the fifth item by changing the old record that was here to the new record. So in that case, we are going to use the default as we saw as part of the syntax of the patch function. Okay, so when we go to the uncheck, the old formula that we are having there is this item. So we have to change these items to defaults, and then we bring back the default has to take the name of the data source. So default, the name of the data source, which is my first, and that is it. Now, if you want to push this to another data source, it's a matter of changing the name of this data source and then placing the name of the new data source there. So when we click this, you see the dot dot, you see that it changes from 4 to 5. It means that we now have a new record that has been added. So we can check from the SharePoint list, and now you see here we have another record being added, Mansa Busa 10,000. So that is the second example that we have looked at. So we have looked at update. So in our next scenario, we are looking at patching from your gallery to a data source on a bottom that is not located inside your gallery. So we have placed the bottom that is outside the gallery on our screen, but we want to patch whichever item is selected in the gallery from this button into the data source. So in that case, you will have to, one of the things that you need to know is that there should be an ID column. So on your data source, so in this data source, I have this ID 123. So if you are using an Excel as a data source, you may have a column that is unique, not necessarily 123, but it should be a unique identifier. Same applies to SQL Server or whatever data source you are using. In my case, I am using a SharePoint list. So I have this formula patch, then I have my data source, then after that, the record to update, I am looking at a particular ID. So patch we are look up ID is equals to value that is in ID test input box. Now when we look at the test input box, I have this item.id 1, and then I have 2, 3 as it is in my data source. So whatever item is selected from the gallery, go back to the data source, compare the ID in this selected item. If it's equal to the ID in the data source, go back and change it. That is the formula. Look up first item ID in the data source. If it is equal to the value in this text input box, then go back and then make these changes to these columns. And the column that I have stated are amount and then first name. So let's see how it goes. I will make a change to, so I have here, I'm going to type Dennis, and then I'm changing the record from 5,006 to say 650. So I'm saying that go back to the data source. If you identify a column with an ID of 3, make the change to Dennis and then change the amount to 650. So I click on the bottom, you see the dots working. Then after that, I will go back to the data source and see if the ID column 3 has really made the various changes that I have done. I think I have a slow internet. Okay, so when we go back to the data source and we see that the row 3 with ID column 3 has really changed to Dennis, and the amount has also changed to 650. Okay, so now we'll move to another scenario. Okay, so in our next scenario, we are looking at making changes to multiple records in the gallery and then pushing same back to the data source. So in all the examples that I've given earlier, we're making records to a particular row. But now, what if you want to make changes to different records or rows in the gallery, and then you want to push all of them back to the data source? So for instance, I make a change to ID1. I change it from Kojo to Elizabeth. I change the amount to say 6520. Then instead of Joyce M, I make it Joyce Dan. And I also change this one from 20 to 12. And then I want to make changes to the data source for these two records that I've made. In that case, this is the formula that I'm using on patch. I'm using ForAll function, and then for the ForAll function, I am renaming the ID column, which is inside the gallery 1.all items, and the new name I'm giving it is new ID. So another control that I have here is a checkbox. Now the purpose of the checkbox is to ensure that although I have made so many changes in the gallery, I will want to ensure that there is not inadvertent sending of data or changing of data. So the user need to really click on this icon to ensure that these ticked icons or these ticked records are the one that I want to patch to the data source. So in the formula, I am checking if checkbox 1 dot value, that is if checkbox 1 has really been checked, then go ahead and look up comparing that the ID in the data source is equal to the new ID. Then when this two conditions are met, go ahead and patch. So if I should go through again, for every record for all in the gallery, rename all the columns with ID to new ID. After that, check if the checkbox inside the gallery has been ticked, or when the checkbox is really true. Then after that, compare the ID in the data source. If the ID is equal to the new ID, that is the renamed ID, then go ahead and patch these columns, the amount and the first name, and you can go ahead and then make various changes. So for this example, I have checked this. So let me change Dennis to say Joel. So I change this Dennis to Joel, and I'm making 657. Now, although I have made changes to 3 items, 1, 2, 3, I am not checking the Joel, meaning that the Joel shouldn't be sent back to the data source. So I go ahead and click on the button. Then we go back to the data source. Let's refresh. So we see Elizabeth has changed. Joyce Dan has changed. Dennis is still Dennis, although I changed it to Joel. So that is it. Now, the advantage of renaming the column and also placing the checkbox inside the gallery is that for all is actually has a very toll on your performance of the app. So if you are using the ForAll function inside the app, make sure you have a way of limiting the number of rows that it will go through. So if you don't need to go through all the columns or the rows in the gallery, then placing the checkbox will help you improve the performance. So only when those checkboxes are ticked that the record will be changed using this ForAll and the patch function. Thank you. So we are moving to our next example or next scenario. So in our next scenario, we are first of all pushing the record from the gallery into a collection. And having finished pushing every record that we want to update into a collection, we will patch from the collection into our data source. In fact, this is the most efficient way of going about this patching as far as this gallery is concerned. So first of all, I have placed a checkbox, and on check of this checkbox, I am collecting the amount and the name columns. That is why we are making changes. You can increase or you can add more into a collection called Call My Items. And then from that, I am picking the ID, and then I'm also picking the amount. I am picking the first name. So for every record, so let's go back to our collection and check. You see that currently I have some items already in the collection. So let me remove them. Let me remove them and then create new items. So let me go back. Okay, so when we go back to the collection, you see that there's nothing in the collection. Okay, so we go back and then we start updating. I update Elizabeth to Frank, change the amount to 80. Then I take this checkbox. Now, when I take this checkbox, the record that have been changed is pushed into the data source. So let me go down and change Mansa Musa to Johnson, and then change this to 3 or 30. Then I collect. I'll go back and change another record to Ike. I will leave this and I collect it. So now I have 3 items selected. Now let's go back to the collection and check whatever is there. Michael. Okay, so we see, sorry, the collection. My internet is a little bit sluggish. So here is the collection. The 3 items that I selected is displayed in the collection. Now from there, let's look at the patch formula. Just as we said earlier, we are renaming the column with the ID to a new ID. Then from there, we are patching into my first. And then before we patch, we are looking up into the data source and then comparing the ID in the data source with the new ID inside the collection. When they match, then we go ahead and patch for each of the record that is listed into the collection back into the data source. So let's see how this thing goes. Okay, so we go back into and check. We change Elizabeth to Ike, is changed, and then we see that the various changes have been made. Okay, so let's look at the same patch using the disambiguation. Now, in our first or in an earlier patch, we renamed the column ID into a new column ID. If you don't want to go by this, you can use the disambiguation to differentiate between the ID in the collection and the ID in the data source. So in that case, for all the collection, patch into my first data source, but however, look up into the data source if the ID is equal to the collection.id. But we are not, because we didn't rename, we are using the disambiguation, that is at ID inside the formula. So this query doesn't give any error and it goes back and then works the same as renaming of the ID column into another ID column. Thank you very much. We go ahead and look at our final scenario. Now, in our final scenario, we are also going to push the data from the gallery to a collection. Then we push the collection to the data source. So in this case, we are going to follow the previous example. When we have a collection, my code, which is currently empty. It doesn't contain any record. Now, on uncheck of this checkbox, we have the same formula that we used previously. Then on uncheck, because we want to remove the item, I also have remove collection this item. So whenever you untick it, the item is removed from the record or from the collection. So we make a change to done. So done 2. I change this to 130. Then I check it. I go back to your menu. I make it Yao Jojo. And I'm changing from 120 to 123. I take it. So when we go back to the data source or the collection, let's check the collection. So we have the two here. We have Joyce 2, Yao Jojo, very defined here with the various ID columns. Now, instead of using the previous formula that we use, we are using a very simple and straightforward patch function. And we are patching to the data source right away from the collection. And this is supposed to be a very good and straightforward way of patching from a collection back to your data source. Now the catch here is that ensure that you have an ID column that is unique in your data source, which has also been pushed into the collection. And that I said earlier. So let's go back and patch and see how it goes. So we are changing two records. We go back to our data source. Let's refresh it. And we see that we have Joyce 2, and then we have Yao Jojo, clearly changed. So this is the end of the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you go ahead and subscribe. I'll be doing a second version of this using either collection and then update if. Thank you very much.